Hello, APES team. In this podcast, we're going to talk about sections 4.1 and 4.2. Chapter 4 is all about biodiversity and evolution. Biodiversity is the variety of life, and evolution is how life changes over time. The case study that this chapter starts off with is the curious case of the missing amphibians. Amphibians are animals like frogs, toads, newts, and salamanders, and they're becoming endangered and even extinct at alarming rates. We believe that this is happening because of the alteration of land and habitat by human activity. Amphibians are very important for a number of reasons. They are biological indicators telling us about the health of the ecosystems that they live in. They play important ecological roles like predator and prey. And they are also storehouses of potential medical drugs and pharmaceutical chemicals that we may be able to use in the future. Amphibian populations are dwindling around the world. This photo shows frogs that have been afflicted by a fungus that is believed to have been spread by the pet and the meat trade. Species are going extinct at an alarming rate. This rate seems to be accelerating if you look at the number of known extinctions over time. The golden toad of Costa Rica, pictured here, was last seen in 1989. We believe that this species went extinct due to either climate change or a fungal infection. In section 4.1, we're going to talk about what diversity is and what makes it important. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and life has been around for 3.7 billion years of it. During that time, lots of different life forms have evolved, creating what we call biodiversity, which is the variety of life. In this class, we will define a species as a group of individuals that can mate with one another and produce fertile offspring. Depending on what source you read, there are an estimated 8 to 100 million species on Earth. About 2 million species are thought to be unidentified. Most of these unidentified species are thought to be found in rainforest and the deep ocean. We can look at biodiversity in many different ways. We can look at species diversity, or the number and variety of species. We can look at genetic diversity, which is the variety of genes in a population. We can look at ecosystem diversity, which is the variety of ecosystems that we have. Ecosystems can be grouped into ecosystems with similar climates and plant life. We call those biomes. Finally, we can look at functional diversity, which is the variety of different processes that happen within an ecosystem. Biodiversity is very important because it allows populations and ecosystems to respond to environmental change and environmental stress. Because of that, biodiversity is a natural resource and therefore part of our natural capital. This infographic summarizes the different ways that we can break down and look at biodiversity. The shells of these marine snails demonstrate genetic diversity. If you travel from the west coast of the United States to the east coast, you'll travel through many different types of ecosystems. This demonstrates the ecosystem diversity of the United States. In section 4.2, we're going to talk about how life on Earth changes over time. What we know about how life has changed over time comes from fossils and the fossil record. Fossils are anything left behind by a once living organism. The fossil record is our entire body of fossil evidence. Most organisms do not leave behind fossils after they die. It's estimated that only 1% of all species that have ever lived on Earth have left fossils for us to find. This is a photograph of an ancient horse. Modern horses evolved from horses that were the size of medium-sized dogs. Evolution is defined as change in life over time. How this happens was first explained by Charles Darwin in his book On the Origin of Species. He called this process natural selection or survival of the fittest. There is a huge body of evidence supporting this idea, and we now call it the theory of evolution by natural selection. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same geographic area. Populations evolve by becoming genetically different from other similar populations. In this definition of evolution, make sure you understand that individuals do not evolve. Giraffes in general get taller, not one giraffe here or one giraffe there. Genetic variation is the first step in biological evolution. You have to have variety: short giraffes, tall giraffes, medium giraffes. And this occurs through mutations in DNA. This photo shows a boy who was born with a mutation in a gene called sonic hedgehog that created the finger pattern you see here. Natural selection is the second step of evolution, in which nature selects the individuals that are the most fit to survive and reproduce. We call individuals with characteristics that help them live in their environment well adapted. Well adapted individuals produce more offspring. Individuals that are not well adapted produce fewer offspring. This is called differential reproduction. One example of all this is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Some bacteria are better at fighting off antibiotics and will produce more offspring than bacteria that cannot. This diagram shows the natural selection of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The antibiotic-resistant bacteria are able to survive exposure to the antibiotic and produce more offspring as a result. The same thing can happen on farms when farmers use pesticides. The insects that are more resistant to the pesticides are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce differentially than the insects that cannot. Human beings were also subject to natural selection. There are 3 adaptations that are thought to have helped humans survive and reproduce in their environment, and those are having an opposable thumb, the ability to walk upright, and a complex brain. So one thing we need to be clear about is that the adaptations and the genes that encode them have to be present before environmental change. For example, you have to have tall giraffes present before natural selection happens, otherwise all giraffes would have died. In natural selection, not all species are treated the same. If you reproduce more often and in greater numbers, you have an advantage. These species are called R-selected. The opposite are called K-selected. K-selected species are species that reproduce infrequently and do not reproduce very many offspring each time they do. These are called survivorship curves, and they show the difference between R-selected species and K-selected species. The type 1 curve shows a K-selected species that produces few offspring that tend to live a long time, often due to parental care. Humans are an example. The type 3 curve is an R-selected species that produces lots of offspring, many of which don't live very long. Plants are an example of that. The type 2 curve is a species somewhere in the middle. Birds are an example there. There are 3 common myths or misconceptions that people often have about evolution. First, make sure you understand that fitness is reproductive success, not strength. The more offspring you have, the more fit you are. Secondly, understand that organisms do not develop traits out of need or want. These things must be present before nature decides to select for them. And then lastly, there is no grand plan that nature has for perfect adaptation. The environment is always changing, and therefore the definition of perfect is always changing.